Center for the Study of World Religions, Harvard Divinity School.
So we'll go ahead and get started. This afternoon is our first panel of papers where we'll make our first intentional turn toward humanistic inquiry here. I'll be your moderator. My name is Russ Powell. I'm a research affiliate at the Center for the Study of World Religions here at the Harvard Divinity School and serve as the research and program specialist for the Thinking with Plants and Fungi research initiative. So we've got an excellent panel to lead off our afternoon programming today, what we've entitled From Margulis to Arber, Romanticism and Mysticism in Plant Science. This panel will explore how scientists, philosophers, and scientist-philosophers draw on aesthetic, mystical, and metaphysical traditions to challenge dominant models of scientific reasoning, individuality, and evolutionary progress. Focusing on the work of Lynn Margulis and Agnes Arber, our speakers will examine how concepts like symbiosis, morphological dynamism, and contemplative seeing unsettle fixed boundaries between self and other, science and spirit, and the one and the many. So I'll introduce our first speaker now, Jacob Erickson, who's going to be followed by Samira Daneshvar. So afterward, when Samira is done, I'll begin the question and answer session and open things up for questions from the room, what's our custom now. We'll wrap up around 2:30, and then I'll pass it back to Charles Stang, who will introduce our next keynote address. So without further ado, let me first introduce our first speaker, Jacob Erickson, who is assistant professor at the School of Religion of Trinity College, Dublin. He's a constructive theologian and theological ethicist who writes to evoke what he calls an ecotheology of planetary conviviality, the playful and just cherishing of life together. So the paper Jacob will present today is entitled The Vegetal and the Manifold, Agnes Arber's Botanical Panentheism. So please join me in welcoming Jacob.
Do a bit of limbo underneath the screen there. Firstly, thank you for all being here after lunch, and thank you to Rachel and the organizers. The hospitality is so excellent that I woke up this morning in my hotel room and the Irish weather had greeted me, so I felt like I was already home. And I'm just delighted to be here, and I'm delighted to be at a transdisciplinary conference at a time when academic freedom and integrity is frequently under assault. It would be easy to go back into disciplinary silos. And so transdisciplinarity at this time, the creativity and the risk of it, I think is so politically important. My partner is in the medical sciences, and I'm a theologian. And so when he comes home and we're talking about being sick and he's giving me the medical reasons of why a particular disease happened, I sort of jive back like, did you check if there were ghosts? And so the humanities and the sciences go along. But in terms of my curiosity, I've been interested in recent years in thinkers who, usually through a form of plant thinking, engage in a kind of transdisciplinary unsaying of the work that they're doing. I'm going to do I can see it on there. We'll see, go back and forth here. It's not on my screen, but Agnes Arber is one of those from 1879 to 1960. Arber was known as a plant morphologist, historian of science, philosopher, and has a curious feature to her thinking that I'm deeply in love with. But I think that this particular epigraph from The Manifold and the One, which is her final book, which I'm going to focus on, could go down as a vital moniker for this conference, that this type of thought cannot be tied down to a clear-cut, prearranged program. We have to leave it free to grow untrammeled in our hands. just 3 short years before Arber dies in 1960, she publishes this book, The Manifold and the One. And it's a book of mysticism. And so I want to give a little bit of background to Arber, talk a little bit about some of the mystical qualities of her work and the work of The Manifold and the One, and then work through a couple things in negative theology that she goes through and particular concepts like the coincidence of contraries that lead her to sort of develop a larger view of the world. So Arber begins in the 1920s and 30s. She's trained as a plant morphologist and botanist and writes a number of texts on the history of herbals and water plants, monocotyledons, which she finishes from her mentor, Ethel Sargent, and a book on the grains. She's working largely in the Balfour Laboratory at Newnham College, Cambridge, occasionally until that arrangement runs out in about 1927. And she goes home, sets up a laboratory in her home in the 20s and 30s, and begins raising, as recently a widow, her daughter Muriel. So if you've read the book Lessons in Chemistry, the Bonnie Garmus book, there's a lot of similarities to this. And Arber has been reclaimed recently in feminist science studies, in some plant philosophy circles. But really these early books are books of sort of classical botany, thinking about plant morphology, roots, shoots, leaves, and engaging in a lot of reflection on these. In the 1930s and 40s, when World War II largely interrupts her ability to get materials, and she decides, there's a great story, she decides that she wants to be a good neighbor and that it's probably not good to have a laboratory in your home during the midst of bombings with flammable chemicals and things. She turns to plant philosophy. And I think a crucial aspect of her thought really is her attention to visual and artistic detail in the morphology. If you were at the glass plants collection yesterday, or if you've been in there, a lot of her drawings are sort of resembling that kind of attention to morphology and plant detail. Her parents were artists. Her father was a painter. Her mother was a ceramicist. And if you look into her archives, the majority of what she talks about is not necessarily the most recent plant theories, but she's asking colleagues as if she's getting her drawings right. It's an artistic kind of vision. In the latter part, so 40s, 50s, she turns to philosophy, natural philosophy, and particularly plant philosophy. She does an introduction and kind of translation of Goethe's Metamorphosis of Plants, an attempt to get at the dynamism of plants. In 1950, the ever important natural philosophy of plant form, where she really sort of unpacks, and it's hard to overstate or understate the importance of this text for contemporary plant philosophy. And in 1954, The Mind and the Eye, which is kind of a manual for how biologists should approach their thinking aesthetically and scientifically. But then again, 3 years before her death, 1957, she publishes a book called The Manifold and the One. And it kind of was like a major faux pas at a dinner party. The room went silent. It's a book of not necessarily of botany on the surface, but a book engaging contemplative mysticism, the histories of negative theology, the unsaying of what can be said about the divine or about reality. And it's a text where you have cross-religious cross traditions, frequently in sentence after sentence. So figures from the Christian tradition, John Scotus Eriugena, Nicholas of Cusa. You have Spinoza. You have Islamic mysticism, Sufi approaches, Al-Ghazali. You have reflections on Japanese tea ceremonies. You have reflections on Taoism, frequently all in the same paragraph. And you can imagine that many botanists, when they picked up this book, oh, Agnes Arber has a new volume out, and flower that's on the cover. These are two different versions. Importantly to note, Cambridge University Press had published all of her previous books, except for this one. And it comes with John Murray in 1957, and then is later republished by the Theosophical Society as a kind of engagement. And really, the reviews came in, and Nature, I think, felt like they had to review it. Sort of, essentially, it's a kind of version of we don't know what to do with this. It was titled Intellectual Mysticism, and really the writer said it's so intelligent, there's so much to comment on that I don't know how to begin. But Maura Flannery, who has been one of the folks, Maura Flannery and Catherine Packer, sort of reclaiming Arber's legacy and reflecting on, really sort of makes a note of this. Most folks, when they're noting Arber's work, give one line or two to this particular book in a kind of dismissal way. Though this is not a work of botany, it's a reflection on the multiplicity and unity of reality. For the biologist's eye, for the botanist's eye, how the many and the one cohere, a really old philosophical question. And Flannery makes this point that, even though her royal biographer dismisses it as kind of condescendingly a philosophical essay, we'll see it's worse than that in a second, Flannery says that this particular book actually is a kind of culmination, or puts a kind of light on all of the previous work that Arber is doing. And so that's kind of what my work is thinking of lately, is how do we think about this particular last book, The Manifold and the One, not as a philosophical essay, a diversion from the full botanical reflection of what Arber has been doing, but in fact as a kind of extension of plant thinking that moves in this nebulous space between botany and metaphysics. It is a kind of plant philosophy, I think, for a number of reasons. This is from the line in the official biography. The last work is a philosophical essay that kind of reflects the life of quiet contemplation that Arber led in the last parts of her life, as if she had disengaged from academic reflection or philosophical engagement or metaphysical reflection. The gender dynamics here are rife, right? But there's a few pieces that come into play in The Manifold and the One that are long and existent throughout Arber's work. And they connect the botanical, the morphological, to the philosophical and the metaphysical. And the first is this, that in the beginning of thinking about mystical experience or metaphysics or the reality of life, she turns to contemplation through particularly a Greek conception of contemplation, or a reading of Greek contemplation. It's important to note that her brother becomes Regius Professor of Greek, and so the classics are incredibly present. She turns to Greek's philosophy's interpretation of theory as beholding, turning, as we so often must, to the Greeks for help. We find what we need in their study of that mental activity, which is named theoria. This word, which is only secondarily equivalent to theory in the modern scientific sense, means primarily beholding. and maybe translated into some context as contemplative seeing. She says this both in The Manifold and the One, but also in the natural philosophy of plant form. She talks about contemplation as the ways in which we understand and make sense of reality writ large, but that begins in her observation of the morphological forms of plants. And so contemplative seeing, contemplative reflection, from Theophrastus, from the Aristotelian tradition, gets magnified. And it gets magnified because she sees a connection between the everyday and the ordinary. The more pedestrian levels of existence are necessary as the soil of which the ultimate mystical state can flower and to which its seed harvest must return. You'll see that for her, mysticism isn't simply an escape from reality, but this kind of integrative synthesis of beholding reality in its complexity. And for her, doing so, engaging in that kind of contemplation, opens up a space for critiquing the human perspective, the anthropocentric perspective, both as a scientist, as a botanist, but also within the large concepts of metaphysics. She writes earlier in The Mind and the Eye, another factor which cramps the biologist's visual thinking is his tendency, and she always uses his when she's engaging in the critique, a tendency to share the general egoism which leads to concentration on the human element in the universe, so that when he looks at an animal or a plant, he's liable to see it not in it is in and of it for itself, but from an anthropocentric standpoint. Iris Brooke calls Arber in recent work one of the heroes of botany that sort of bucks the trend of the Western devaluation of plants for this. Specifically, when she's engaging in contemplation and morphology, she recommends 3 specific steps, and this is in the natural philosophy of plant form. She argues that you have to see the plant with a kind of sensuous perception. This goes to the questions of imagination and observation scientifically that we were talking about earlier. You have to see the plant with a kind of sensuous perception, and the sensuousness, I think, is really interesting here. There's a tactile or affective element to it. You have to fill out that mental picture of the plant as sort of a kind of role of imagination of how you see the plant. And then she makes this third move, which I think is really interesting. You have to go beyond that static image to see it in its living aspect and in relation to other forms. The initial proposal of the observation of the sensuous perception of the plant, that kind of formal old school botanical morphology, which then, when you see the plant in its living aspect, begins to undo itself, begins to deconstruct or begins to unsay itself, that reservoir of a kind of mystery or alterity that's in the core of plants as relational and growing beings with a certain kind of vitality. Stella Sanford, who has, I first encountered Arber's work at the Philosophical Life of Plants project, gathering at the University of Bristol, and we read Natural Philosophy of Plant Form together. Stella makes the observation that Arber looks back at Aristotle's concept of form here, which she understood to return to the intrinsic nature of which any given individual was a manifestation, and then goes beyond, considerably beyond Aristotle. She took this intrinsic nature to encompass the entire life history of a plant, included changes in the size and the outward shape of the plant, thus redefining form as dynamic, not just a static reality, and refusing to separate it analytically from function. Form and function, dynamism go together. It leads her to this sort of contemplative seeing leads her to a kind of non-linear thought, a thought that I soon found that trying to think about the nature and the relations of the one and the many, which is this problem that she had tracks in multiple books prior to her last one at the very sort of end of Natural Philosophy of Plant Form and in The Mind and the Eye. She says, there's this weird thing about the relationships between the one and the many of the universe that I'm trying to figure out. And it's in Manifold and the One, she says it's always been there. I soon found that in trying to think about the nature and the relations of the one and the many, the simple linear type of thought and argument which is used in dealing with scientific problems does not suffice. We can no longer depend exclusively upon straightforward sequences. I'm thinking of Rachel's image from the beginning of nonlinear wandering, right? From premises to conclusions by means of orthodox logical thinking. Her thinking grows untrammeled. And what she says is that it moves not just as a kind of linear logic, A to B, B to C, C to D, but in the image of what she calls it reticulate or honeycomb pattern. The way that we actually engage in contemplation and reflection occurs in this kind of reticulate multiplicity simultaneously, and that's when we begin sort of engaging in ongoing reflection. Think about that kind of image, one of those cross-cuttings of a plant, or an image of articulate piece of a plant cell, for instance. So from there, what's interesting is that rather than thinking about botany, and this is probably what turned off most folks who knew Arber's work, she turns to histories of mysticism. Largely Christian mysticism, I'll note, but in particularly the 15th century German cardinal Nicholas of Cusa. I've been commenting on the Pope's election this last week, so to go from this to this, cardinals all hovering around. Cusa gave Arber language for the ways that she's thinking about how you articulate the form and that unsettlingness of plant morphology simultaneously. Nicholas of Cusa first is known for his concept of learned ignorance, that we don't just simply not know things and we don't simply aggregate facts, but in fact we learn in an ongoing process of that kind of undoing. We learn more and more about what we know and what we don't know, that opening gap. And in his negative theology, he has this concept called the coincidentia oppositorum, the coincidence of opposites, that in the fullness of reality frequently, as Arber will call them, the coincidence of contraries occurs. And she says, interestingly enough, that with regards to plants, this is how she explains a 15th century Christian mystic, that this idea of unmediated opposites is a crude one, maybe, and meaning that you can't just collapse coincidences of contraries in reality. How do you explain this? Can be illustrated from the study of the classification of living things. A student at the textbook stage might say glibly that monocotyledons can be distinguished from dicotyledons by having the parts of their flowers in threes. But in actual fact, this trimary is by no means universal in monocotyledons, meaning sometimes monocotyledons have different numbers, while it is sometimes to be found in dicotyledons. Meaning this is in one of this sort of rare moments in this final book. She uses botany to sort of explain and extrapolate a deep concept in how reflections on metaphysics happens in 15th century negative theology, meaning that these contraries exist and it leaves room for a kind of unknowing. And then finally with Cusa, so you had learned ignorance, the coincidence of contraries, and then these two movements of how Cusa talks about the universe in terms of complicatio and explicatio, the complicatedness, the infolding of reality, and the explicatio, the explication of reality. And she uses this to deconstruct, I would say is the word she doesn't use it, but the relationship between transcendence and immanence. Transcendence doesn't win out, neither does immanence. They're both interrelated and complicatedly folded into one another. Reason and emotion, mind and body, these things that are bifurcations and binaries of reality, suddenly find that in reality, like you're observing the form and the unfolding of a plant, neither one triumphs. And the finite and the infinite. The finite isn't the ultimate reality, the infinite isn't the ultimate reality, but the finite gives taste to the infinite in this kind of synthesis. I think what's remarkable about it is that what she does in this turn to contemplative mysticism is challenge a kind of a history of the tradition of the one always winning out, the logic of the one winning out. And Laurel Schneider has helpfully here talked about the ways that the one frequently wins out, the coloniality of the one, the political approach of the one, the logic of the one, that it moves around like a stone in the throat, and the story of the one sometimes denies the fleshiness and the sudden shiftiness of bodies it cannot abide, and moves with unfinished business. So what Arber does, I think, is takes into appreciation the unity and the multiplicity of reality while recognizing that they condition each other, which makes her diverge from certain forms of, say, classical Christianity or classical forms of monotheism, where a kind of a domineering royal version of divinity wins out, or a kind of ultimate sense of the formality of a certain plant wins out, the multiplicity of form wins out. So just to conclude here, I come back to these covers because the covers of the books represent not, I don't think, a sense of marketing. We've got this famous botanist who's reflecting on mysticism. Let's put a flower on the cover, maybe we'll sell more books. But in fact, a vision of the folding and unfolding of reality that Arber sees, the complicatio and explicatio, like a flower folding and unfolding in response to sunlight, the pulses of unity and multiplicity might offer a kind of synthesis and interactivity. Quote Arber, the processes of transition from the one to the many and from the many to the one are thus seen in the organism as alternating sequences strung out in time. Can it be that it is in this to and fro relation between the one and the many that the very essence of livingness is revealed? Life would then be neither unity alone nor the manifold alone, but would be visualized as their joint expression, in which predominance is accorded to each in turn in constant rhythm, that rhythm of infolding and exfolding, constantly sort of unsettling the expectations of the clarity of reality. For her, the many is in the one, and the one is in the many. The one is the manifold, she says, and the manifold is the one. And it leads her then, of course, to say, that maybe possible for, important for us, is that in her engagement with multiple religious traditions, it's not as if she's collecting them in this text like a botanist might pin down, or a flower samples as the good example of all these different kinds of approaches. But she's approaching with a kind of humility, I think, that she learns from observing plants, a kind of sense that multiple religious traditions have provisional views on truth and a sense of ultimate reality. And if we take that multiplicity seriously, we have to engage in that infolding and unfolding time and time again. So infolding, unfolding. Oh, and just to say that it's nice to see she's finally getting some acknowledgement from University of Cambridge, UK, and with a new gin.
So now I'll introduce our second presentation on our panel this afternoon. It's from Samira Daneshvar. Samira is a PhD candidate in the theory and history of architecture here at Harvard University. She explores critical episodes in environmental thought across histories of science, media, and technology, with a particular interest in materiality and spatial relations between and within bodies. The title of her presentation here this afternoon is A Romantic Reading of Lynn Margulis' Theory of Symbiogenesis. So please join me now in welcoming Samira Daneshvar.
Thank you very much. And I'm very honored to be here today and thrilled to share my contribution to this very diverse room of people from diverse disciplines. So as the title of my paper indicates, I will present a close reading of Margulis' symbiogenesis theory, analyzing the romantic ethos sustained in the scientific and philosophical essence of the theory and expressed in its literary and visual language. Before I get to symbiogenesis, I would like to provide an overview of Romanticism to demonstrate Margulis's productive synthesis of romantic and scientific thought. Romanticism was born out of modernity and in protest against it. It emerged in response to the Enlightenment values of reason and order, manifesting in the arts, sciences, politics, philosophy, ethics, and religion. Characterized by a holistic vision, Romanticism adopted a revolutionary attitude toward the physical world, where subjective experience served as a lens to mend the growing rift between humans and their surroundings. The Romantic science of the 19th century fostered human sensibility through observation and empirical studies of plants, animals, and minerals. Breaking away from dividing narratives that split between subject and object, the self and the world, Romantic philosophy conceived nature as an organic whole in an eternal process of metamorphosis. From this perspective, the ceaseless formation, transformation, and reproduction embody nature's ordered multiplicity. However, toward the end of the 19th century, with the emphasis on neutral and impersonal voice, the tenets of Romanticism were increasingly viewed as obstacle to true science and thereby vilified. Nevertheless, the ideological influence of this period sporadically resurfaced in the work of 20th century natural scientists. An example of this, as I shall demonstrate, is symbiogenesis as theorized by American evolutionary biologist Lynn Margulis. Between Margulis's two major contributions, which are the development of serial endosymbiosis theory and the co-development of Gaia hypothesis with James Lovelock, only the romantic tenets of Gaia hypothesis are scholarly analyzed. For example, Bruce Clark, a scholar of literature and science, identifies Gaia as secular but wrapped in romantic sanctity. He explains that the Gaia theory underwent quote-unquote a theomorphosis despite its original conception. Clark writes, quote, "Besides the name Gaia, the description of the earth as a living organism represents romantic vitalism." Another attribute comes from Jade Hagen, who similarly writes that, quote, "Gaia hypothesis draws on a long intellectual tradition of anima mundi, or word soul, a variant of natural philosophy with well-developed roots in the Romantic period." The name Gaia, as Margulis herself describes it, is embedded with the holistic vision. She writes, quote, "Gaia suggests the autopoiesis of the biosphere as a whole. The Gaia theory henceforth has been gravely criticized for romanticizing evolutionary science." Countering such criticism, however, in my analysis of Margulis's symbiogenesis theory, I emphasize the significance of reanimating romantic ideals for pivoting environmental consciousness. Although Margulis does not explicitly use the term romantic or romanticism, her theory of symbiogenesis engages romantic sensibility in scientific content as well as the aesthetic forms of representation. I suggest that while Margulis's symbiogenesis theory is grounded in hard sciences, it inflects the romantic ethos. By bringing the subjective human intuition together with objective science, her work appeals to the reader's sentiment. Her theory of evolution, conceived during the rise of environmental awareness in the United States, fosters human identification with nature. Thereby, Margulis transformed the century-old theory of symbiogenesis into an influential framework for rethinking human-non-human alliances. The earliest reformulation of symbiogenesis or serial endosymbiosis theory, as in Margulis's coinage, appeared in her 1967 paper titled "On the Origin of Mitosing Cells." Today, a leading evolutionary theory, her proposition was for long neglected. Dating back to the 19th century, symbiogenesis was historically a radical idea. From Greek syn, meaning together, bios meaning life, and genesis meaning origin and birth, symbiogenesis is an evolutionary term. For Margulis, symbiogenesis refers to the origins of new tissues, organs, and organisms by establishing long-term or permanent symbiosis. And with the term symbiosis, Margulis refers to its original 1879 coinage by German botanist Anton de Bary, meaning, quote, living together of unlike organisms. Margulis's elucidation of symbiosis involves causal, facultative, and prolonged relationships. She writes, symbiosis brings together different life forms, always for a reason. Symbionts sense and recognize each other. They fuse and establish integrating mechanisms for prolonged associations. In her 1967 paper, formative paper, Margulis established, substantiated, and advanced the symbiogenesis theory with recent but isolated observation and experiments ranging from cytology to biochemistry, paleontology, and geology that reported evidence on the formation of associations between living organisms in deep time. She synthesized this wide range of studies from the perspective of molecular genetics and metabolism, proposing that all cells with nuclei are multi-genome systems evolved during millions of years of interactions between highly responsive ancestor organisms. She argued that cytoplasmic organelles, which populate cellular bodies, are remnants of ancestral bacteria that ended up living together symbiotically within a single cell. Margulis asserted that these organelles resemble the general anatomical features, physiological behaviors, and metabolic characteristics of ancestral bacterial cells which are still free-living or whose traces could be found in fossils. Margulis explained that for the first 2 billion years of life on Earth, bacteria were the plant's only inhabitants. They continually transformed the Earth's surface and atmosphere, creating all of life's essential chemical processes, including fermentation, photosynthesis, oxygen respiration, and conversion of atmospheric nitrogen into proteins. The emergence of these chemical systems triggered global crises in bacterial population, leading to their starvation and intoxication long before the dawn of larger life forms. Margulis theorized that the incorporation of one bacterium by another was an evolutionary response to surviving these crises. In her theory, 4 once independent and physically separate ancestor bacteria allied and merged in a particular order, as the word cereal in cereal endosymbiosis indicates. First, the swimming bacterium merged with the acid and heat-tolerant fermenting bacterium, and then the oxygen-breathing bacterium was incorporated. The composite resulted in the ancestral cell, or protist, an example of which is the blue-green algae. From the protist, plants, fungi, and animal cells descended. Therefore, in Margulis's account of symbiogenesis, evolutionary leaps happened after a great struggle in which one bacterium was invaded by another but not destroyed, preyed upon but survived inside the predator, ingested but not digested, or infected by another but not eliminated. Following such encounters, Margulis explains, a truce was an innovative mechanism that ensured the survival of the symbionts. The literal incorporation of one bacterium into another then turned into cohabitation. For example, non-photosynthetic protists, Margulis explains, whether or not they indulge in sex, they always eat. Some will eat anything under stress conditions. If desiccated, starved, irradiated, or otherwise in imminent danger of death and attempting to save themselves by eating their fellows, they fuse rather than die alone. In this process, genes from bacterium that were trapped or consumed by another bacterium continued to survive within the host cell, eventually transforming it. The visiting bacterium's genetic codes were translated, enabling the host cell to perform functions that its own genes could not accomplish. The endosymbionts, or the visiting bacterium, ultimately became a cytoplasmic organelle in the host cell. Exchanging metabolic products and genetic materials ensured the survival of co-symbionts. Therefore, over time, from a causal predator and prey relation, a stable and eventually permanent liaison evolved. Margulis asserts, quote, life has been chemically connected to its past since its inception and with no discontinuity. The organic bond between all life forms that prevail throughout space and time, as she put forth, evokes a holistic vision akin to Romanticism. Margulis contended that once independent microbes, quote unquote, teamed up and merged, they lost their singular individualities. Every entity is henceforth a composite, a unity that is a product of co-evolved microbial communities. She writes, quote, united, the symbionts formed a single individual and generated myriad of offsprings of multi-unit symbiotic new individuals. Such characterization of organisms as indivisible wholes of multiple individuals are reminiscent of the Romantic vision for unity in multiplicity. Moreover, instead of competition, Margulis emphasized how organisms form communities to survive planetary crises. She argued that symbiosis is far more innovative in generating biological change than competition. Margulis maintained that natural selection operates not so much by acting on competing organisms that have accumulated random mutations, but by acting on new kind of organisms that have evolved through symbiogenesis. Natural selection, according to her, led to greater intimacy of the partners. The longer the alliance between organisms, the more they fused. Thereby, Margulis strived to change our perception of evolution as a relentless competition among organisms and species. She wrote, quote, life took over the globe not by combat, but by networking. Life forms multiplied and grew more complex by co-opting others, not just by killing one another. Furthermore, Margulis challenged the conception of cellular membranes and enclosing boundaries. She noted that an organic membrane is not a concrete literal wall, but a constantly changing semi-permeable barrier. Viewed through the lens of symbiogenesis, quote, cells are environments that allow for crossings of taxonomic boundaries. Besides symbiogenesis, wherein she theorizes the crossings of entire organisms through cellular membranes in the deep past, Margulis also discusses the contemporary experiments on the intracellular transfer of genetic material. Thus, not only theoretically, but also empirically, she rejected the notion of organisms as fixed entities with materially closed surfaces. For example, she discussed lichens, as shown on the left, the plant-like community of organisms formed by cyclical associations, in which genes flow between fungi and photosynthesizer algae or bacteria. She also discussed the transfer of genes and metabolic products from the nodules of nitrogen-fixing bacteria to the plant roots, as shown in the middle, and the conferral of tumorigenic traits from bacteria into plants, shown on the right. By breaking the rigidity of definitive boundaries between living organisms, Margulis cultivated a sensibility for the fluidity of life that echoes the metaphysics of Romanticism. Throughout her work, Margulis invited the readers to consider Earth's biota not as an interdependent collective of discrete membrane-bound organisms, but as a semi-continuous spectrum of interactive life forms. By extending the kindred ancestry of humanity back to primal forms of life, she undermined the idea of humans as autonomous beings. Margulis asserted that as polygenomic entities, we humans possess, quote, selves of multiple origins. She described the dating of human life as, quote, biologically absurd and totally artificial, noting that human life began as all life did, at least 3.5 billion years ago, with the first bacteria. By positioning humans in the fluidity of life across boundaries, Margulis invoked subjective sensibility, a notion that recalls Romantics' subject-oriented philosophy. Margulis employed literary and visual aesthetics to enhance the rhetoric of science. As early as her 1967 paper, she established terms such as relationship and association to communicate her findings to the academic audience. In popular writings, furthermore, she marshaled intimate expressions to describe interspecies relations. For instance, she opens her book Symbiotic Planet by describing symbiosis as, quote, the living together in physical contact of organisms of different species. Partners in symbiosis or fellow symbionts abide in the same place at the same time, literally touching each other or even living inside each other. All organisms are touching because all are bathed in the same air and the same flowing water. She adds elsewhere, stereoendosymbiosis is the theory of coming together, of merging of selves of different histories and abilities. In both her academic and popular writings, Margulis consistently described the process of establishing associations between distant organisms as, quote, teaming up, commingling, alliance, cooperation, and cohabitation. She referred to affiliated organisms as fellows and partners. These recurring terms signal the romantic tenets that underpinned her scientific pursuits. Similar to the literary language, the visual aesthetics in her work also amplify the romantic ethos of symbiogenesis. These include photographs, drawings, and diagrams. Most notably, the stippling technique, which is frequently used for Margulis's drawings, aligns the scientific framework with the romantic vision of unity in multiplicity. Stippling is a technique of making a surface by applying points or dots of single pigments, often without using linear borders or edges. The denser the dots, the more intense the shades. The pictorial technique relies on optical perception, especially regarding how vision involves synthesizing a series of impressions registered on the retina. The points merge cognitively, recreating forms that summon an image. Although color is absent from the stippling technique, similar to pointillism, which relies on the mental mixture of colored points, stippling also relies on optical processes to create an image. Both techniques navigate the relationship between subjective expression and the physical world through the multiplicity of points. In Symbiotic Planet, Margulis explicitly characterizes bacterial ancestry as pointillists. She writes, quote, human and other animal consciousness, as well as other types of biological beauty and complexity, are properties of our co-evolving pointillist bacterial ancestry. This reference to bacteria as pointillist suggests that the stippling technique was favorable to Margulis, not only because it relies on perception to recreate reality, therefore challenging the duality of subject and object, but also because dots are allegorically significant to the scientific philosophy echoed in symbiogenesis. The points or dots represent the microcosm, the multiplicity of which coheres into an image, just as the multitude of bacteria come together, forming new life in Margulis's theorization. Among scientific illustrators commissioned to produce Margulis's drawings, Laszlo Mazzoli is frequently acknowledged by Margulis. Mazzoli, who was then based at the Harvard Museum of Comparative Zoology, described the working processes as collaborative. He noted that receiving initial information from the scientist, including a specimen to examine, sometimes under a microscope, was followed by adjustments from the scientist at different stages, until, quote, the image became a resource, documenting its subject as much as describing it. Evidence of this process can be found in Margulis's archives. Margulis elaborates, quote, the artist's way of viewing organisms enhanced our own appreciation immensely. As in the descriptive tradition of natural history, for Margulis too, the images illuminate and are illuminated by the text. To conclude, Margulis's inquiry into evolution did not terminate in scientific ends. For her, science had philosophical implications. In her final book titled Dazzle Gradually, she writes, science is a liberal art, a way of knowing. Through science, one could go about answering important philosophical questions. Therefore, despite the objective science's opposition to engaging sentiments and extracting moral meaning from the knowledge of nature, Margulis integrated subject and object. In doing so, she cultivated a moral identification with nature through science. Margulis fostered human sensibility as a way of understanding the more than human world. She animated the metaphysical dimension of evolution by demonstrating the permeability of taxonomic boundaries and fluidity of life across organisms. Symbiogenesis challenges humans' assumption of individuality, uniqueness, and independence. Recognizing that we are comprised of multiplicities, an aggregate of other life forms, and that our ancestors are bacteria is humbling, she noted. Such awareness is reminiscent of the romantic ethos that Margulis adopted and advanced in her work. Raising environmental consciousness under the lure of Romanticism is a key legacy for which she has yet to be acknowledged. Thank you.
Thanks to you both for these rich and thought-provoking presentations. I will get started with the question and answer. I'll ask a question for both of our presenters to answer in turn, and then we'll open it up to the room. If you'll just raise your hand and we'll find you with a microphone. So for my question, I want to ask how each of you understand the tension between mystical or aesthetic modes of knowing and scientific explanation in contemporary plant thought. So often in the sciences, things that don't quite make sense on a register of scientific rationality, as well as things that suggest a level of like relational depth or interdependency that we don't have a adequate scientific measure for, right? These are described often as mystical. Both of you in your presentations engage historical figures who resisted strictly mechanistic or reductive scientific thinking to emphasize subjective or mystical forms of knowledge, right? Arber through contemplative botany, apophatic theology, Margulis through romantic aesthetics. So how do these ways of knowing challenge prevailing scientific norms? And what do you think are the risks and rewards of recovering these forms of knowing for something like plant studies today?
It's the hazard of being an environmental ethicist. It's like none of the technology works. That's the joke, right? I mean, in the word mystery is used in a lot of reckless ways, right? When violence happens or folks are working to explain the problem of evil, oh, it's just a mystery. and that does a lot of violence. And in scientific approaches, right, saying that something's just a mystery frequently can be a veil to say either don't go there or that I'm not willing to go there, and so I want to hedge my bets and say it's a mystery. But I think one of the things this is why I really love the way that Arber uses the language of contemplation, because it doesn't deploy mystery in the same way. It begins in not necessarily in scientific truth or metaphysical truth, but it begins in the process and the process of trusting that engagement with sensuous perception and engaging in the unpacking of the imaginative vision. For her, the artistic and imaginative vision, which sometimes fills out, was necessary. And so she recognized, especially in The Mind and the Eye, that part of the mystery is that actually the humanities is always present in the scientific endeavor, actually. And so if you recognize that as part of the process and part of an ongoing appreciation of the way that the ordinary works, it doesn't mean that mystery is an endpoint or this kind of reserve in the midst of it that you can never get to, but it's in fact always accompanying the everyday along the way. There's a sense in which that finite livingness is in fact part of the work. That can be, to answer your second question, that can be dangerous in the sense that there's a sense in which you can sort of over romanticize a kind of glory in that contemplative vision that can become extractive, right? This is, oh, look at this really beautiful, wonderful thing, therefore I need it. And the history of botany and its colonial forms, and in the collections of, we have in Dublin the Dead Zoo, which is these sort of ideal collections of specimens, that's a sense in which, oh, look at this beautiful ideal thing that represents the natural mystery of the universe that we're going to collect and pin it down and kill it. Right? So there's an indeterminacy there that I think is always important to be questioning, but acknowledging the sort of cultural context in which one is engaging in a scientific contemplative endeavor is something that's vital for Arber, at least, I think.
And I would like to first answer based on like Margulis's work. So her work was resisted for a very long time. And at the beginning, she didn't have so much of like romantic ideas in the very like the initial papers. But like by the end, like as she started writing like more for popular audience, like you can see it coming more through. So like in terms of like Margulis's work, like she's not, the Gaia, as I mentioned, like the Gaia hypothesis is like very much criticized for and put aside because of like romantic attributes that it was given to, but the symbiogenesis is not so much analyzed in that way. I mean, there is, I think there's a lot of work to be done, and I think that her work is by bringing like empathy and this way of like connecting the subject and object, like it is effective in a way that like science, like it goes beyond the limits of science, like objective science. Yeah.
Thank you both, Jacob and Samira, for these wonderful talks. I'll walk up, Charlie. Yes.
cswr.hds.harvard.edu, copyright 2025, the President and Fellows of Harvard College.